The dawn of November 1st, 1954, broke like any other in the Aures Mountains, in the eastern region of Algeria. But beneath the apparent daily normality, a revolution was fermenting that would definitively transform the course of world geopolitics and redefine the contours of the Cold War. While the Western powers and the Soviet Union were measuring forces in territories distant from Europe and Asia, a small Algerian clandestine organization was preparing to unleash an insurrection that would place France in an extremely delicate position in the context of the global bipolar confrontation. The Revolutionary Committee of Unity and Action, which would later transform into the National Liberation Front, FLN, was coordinating the final preparations for a series of simultaneous attacks that would mark the formal beginning of the Algerian War and simultaneously open a new front in the complex dynamics of the Cold War on the African continent. The choice of the date was neither casual nor devoid of political and strategic symbolism. November 1st represented All Saints' Day in the Christian calendar, a date traditionally associated with reflection and spiritual contemplation, but which also evoked the memory of martyrs and those who fought for the faith. For the Algerian nationalists, the religious symbolism perfectly intertwined with the sacred character of the struggle for national independence, transforming that dawn into a moment of profound historical and spiritual significance. The preparations had been meticulously organized for months, with clandestine cells strategically distributed throughout the Algerian territory, from the Aures Mountains to the coastal plains of Mitidja, passing through the cities of Algiers, Oran, and Constantine. The coordination between the different cells demonstrated a level of organization and determination that would surprise both the French authorities and international observers, revealing the political and military maturity achieved by the Algerian nationalist movement. The international context in 1954 presented particularly favorable characteristics for the start of a war of national liberation in North Africa. The French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, which occurred in May of that same year, had demonstrated the vulnerability of the French colonial empire to well-organized and determined resistance movements, especially when they had significant external and popular support. The end of the French Indochina War freed up military resources and political attention that could be redirected to other colonial fronts, but it also highlighted the structural limitations of the French imperial project in the post-World War II context. Simultaneously, the Geneva Conference on Indochina had established important precedents for the resolution of colonial conflicts through international negotiations, creating expectations and models that would profoundly influence the later development of the Algerian question on the world stage. The geopolitical dimension of the Algerian insurrection widely transcended the borders of the Maghreb and connected directly with the global dynamics of the Cold War. The Algerian nationalist movement developed at a time when both the United States and the Soviet Union were seeking to expand their respective spheres of influence on the African continent, taking advantage of the decolonization process to establish strategic alliances with the new independent states or with the national liberation movements. France, as a European colonial power and a founding member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, found itself in a particularly complex position, as it had to balance its commitments to its Western allies and its imperial ambitions at a moment when global bipolarization imposed increasingly defined and exclusive choices. The Algerian question would rapidly transform into a source of significant tensions within the Atlantic Alliance itself, especially in relations between Paris and Washington. The preparations for the insurrection also revealed a sophisticated understanding by the Algerian nationalists of regional and global geopolitical realities. The independence movement had established important connections with the newly independent governments of Morocco and Tunisia, which would provide fundamental logistical and political support bases for sustaining the armed struggle. These regional alliances were part of a broader strategy of internationalizing the Algerian conflict, which sought to mobilize the support of Arab and African countries, as well as attract the attention and eventual support of the major world powers interested in weakening the French position on the African continent. The leadership of the National Liberation Front demonstrated a keen perception of the importance of the international dimension in conducting wars of national liberation in the context of the Cold War. anticipating strategies that would subsequently be adopted by other independence movements in different parts of the world. The first shots of the Algerian Revolution echoed simultaneously in more than 30 different locations, strategically distributed throughout the national territory, in an impressive demonstration of coordination and planning that completely caught the French colonial authorities by surprise. The actions included attacks on military installations, police stations, arms depots, and communication infrastructures, executed by small groups of guerrillas who emerged from the mountains and disappeared back into the arid and rugged landscape of the Algerian rural regions. The strategy adopted by the insurgents revealed a sophisticated understanding of guerrilla warfare tactics, inspired by the experiences of the French resistance during World War II and the anti-colonial struggles that were simultaneously developing in other parts of the African and Asian continents. The objective was not to occupy territories or directly confront the French forces in conventional battles, but rather to demonstrate the capacity for action of the nationalist movement and mobilize the Algerian population around the cause of independence. The initial reaction of the French authorities was characterized by a grave underestimation of the magnitude and political significance of the events of November 1st. The Governor-General of Algeria, Jacques Soustelle, and the French military commanders interpreted the attacks as isolated actions by bandits or religious extremists, without understanding that it was the coordinated beginning of a war of national liberation with deep international ramifications. This erroneous perception led to an inadequate military response in the first weeks, allowing the guerrillas to consolidate their positions in the mountainous regions and establish logistical and political support networks among the rural population. The French underestimation of the events also revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the political and social transformations that had been taking place in Algerian society since the end of World War II, particularly the growth of national consciousness and the influence of anti-colonial ideologies spreading across the African continent. The political manifesto released by the National Liberation Front on the day of the insurrection clearly established the objectives and strategy of the independence movement, demonstrating a political maturity and strategic vision that surprised international observers and French authorities. The document proclaimed the restoration of the sovereign, democratic, and social Algerian state within the framework of Islamic principles, and appealed for the solidarity of all Arab and Muslim nations, as well as all peoples struggling against colonialism and imperialism. This careful formulation of political objectives revealed a deliberate strategy of inserting the Algerian conflict into the global dynamics of the Cold War, positioning the struggle for independence as an integral part of the global confrontation between progressive and conservative forces, between national liberation movements and imperialist powers. The manifesto also constituted a direct appeal for international support, particularly from Third World countries and powers interested in weakening the French position on the African continent. The religious dimension of the Algerian insurrection acquired particular relevance in the context of the Cold War rivalries, especially considering the growing importance of the Islamic world in the geopolitical strategies of the major powers. The appeal to Islamic principles contained in the National Liberation Front manifesto represented not only a strategy for internal popular mobilization, but also an attempt to connect the Algerian struggle with the Arab nationalist movements developing in the Middle East and North Africa, many of which maintained complex relations with both the United States and the Soviet Union. The Egyptian Revolution of 1952, led by the Free Officers movement, had established a model of Arab nationalism that combined socialist and Islamic elements, attracting both Soviet interest and Western concern. The Algerian insurgency was part of this broader regional context, contributing to the emergence of an Arab nationalist axis that would significantly complicate the strategic calculations of the superpowers in the region. The initial international reactions to the events of November 1st immediately revealed the geopolitical complexity of the Algerian question in the context of the Cold War. The United States, committed to supporting France within the framework of the Atlantic Alliance, but simultaneously interested in maintaining good relations with the Arab and African countries undergoing decolonization, adopted a position of cautious neutrality that avoided explicitly taking sides in the conflict. This American stance reflected the fundamental contradictions of United States foreign policy during the period, which sought simultaneously to support European allies in maintaining international stability and to win the sympathy of the peoples of the Third World in the competition with the Soviet Union for global influence. The Dwight Eisenhower administration quickly understood that the Algerian question could transform into a source of significant tensions within the Western alliance itself, especially if the conflict prolonged and radicalized. The escalation of the Algerian conflict during the first months of 1955 progressively revealed the depth of the geopolitical transformations that the November 1st insurrection had unleashed on the regional and global dynamics of the Cold War. The French military response, initially limited and disorganized, quickly evolved into a large-scale counterinsurgency campaign, which involved sending tens of thousands of additional soldiers and implementing exceptional measures that effectively suspended civil liberties throughout the Algerian territory. This French military escalation had immediate repercussions in international relations, particularly in multilateral institutions where France saw itself increasingly isolated in the face of criticism from Third World countries and discrete pressures from its own Western allies. The Algerian question began to appear regularly in discussions of the United Nations General Assembly, transforming into a recurring theme of confrontation between the Western Bloc and non-aligned countries, with the Soviet Union skillfully exploiting these divisions to weaken the cohesion of the Atlantic Alliance. The development of the French military strategy in Algeria demonstrated the influence of counterinsurgency doctrines developed during the Indochina War, but adapted to the geographical and cultural specificities of the North African theater of operations. The implementation of the quadrillage system, which divided the Algerian territory into rigidly controlled military zones, and the creation of the specialized administrative sections administrative spécialisées, SAS, which combined military and administrative action to win the hearts and minds of the rural population, revealed a sophisticated understanding of the challenges posed by guerrilla warfare in the colonial context. However, these tactical and strategic innovations were accompanied by methods of interrogation and repression that systematically violated international conventions on human rights, creating a growing political problem for France in international forums and contributing to the deterioration of the French image among world public opinion, especially in the newly independent countries of the Third World. The progressive internationalization of the Algerian conflict was particularly evident in the establishment of logistical and political support networks that transcended the borders of the Maghreb and extended throughout the Arab and Islamic world. The Egyptian government of Gamal Abdel Nasser quickly transformed into one of the main supporters of the Algerian cause, providing not only propaganda through the powerful Radio Cairo, but also weaponry, military training, and support bases for the leaders of the National Liberation Front. This Egyptian-Algerian alliance was part of Nasser's broader strategy of positioning Egypt as the leader of Arab nationalism and as a regional power independent of the Cold War superpowers, while maintaining pragmatic relations with both according to Egyptian national interests. Egyptian support for the Algerian insurrection also constituted an indirect way of pressuring France and Great Britain, who still held important positions in the Middle East and represented obstacles to Egyptian regional ambitions. The position of the Soviet Union regarding the Algerian conflict gradually evolved from an attitude of cautious observation to increasing political support, although always calibrated to avoid direct confrontations with the Western powers that could compromise other, more priority Soviet interests. Moscow quickly understood the potential of the Algerian question to weaken the French position in the Atlantic Alliance and to demonstrate to the populations of the Third World the moral and political superiority of the socialist system over Western imperialism. Soviet support materialized mainly through diplomatic channels, with the USSR systematically defending the right of the Algerian people to self-determination in international forums and denouncing the human rights violations committed by French forces. This strategy allowed the Soviet Union to present itself as a defender of oppressed peoples without assuming direct military commitments that could dangerously escalate tensions with the West, thus maintaining the necessary flexibility to manage other, more important theaters of the Cold War. The Suez Canal crisis in 1956 constituted a fundamental turning point in the evolution of the Algerian question in the context of the Cold War, creating an unexpected convergence of interests between France and Israel against Nasser's Egypt, which actively supported the Algerian insurrection. The French decision to participate in the tripartite military operation against Egypt revealed the extent to which the Algerian struggle had transformed French strategic priorities, leading Paris to risk relations with the United States and with international public opinion to eliminate one of the main sources of external support for the Algerian nationalists. French participation in the Suez adventure also demonstrated how the Algerian question was inextricably linked to the regional dynamics of the Middle East and the rivalries between medium powers seeking to maintain or expand their spheres of influence in a context of accelerating transformation of the international system. The failure of the Suez operation, forced by joint pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union, represented a significant political humiliation for France and contributed to further radicalizing French positions regarding the Algerian question. The year 1957 marked a dramatic intensification of the Algerian conflict with the Battle of Algiers, which transformed the colonial capital into an urban battlefield where the most modern techniques of psychological warfare and counterinsurgency developed by the French military were tested. The decision to transfer all police powers to the army under the command of General Jacques Massu represented a turning point in French strategy, which definitively abandoned any pretense of resolving the conflict through political reforms or administrative concessions. The systematic implementation of torture as a method of interrogation and the use of psychological warfare techniques against the Algerian civilian population transformed the city of Algiers into a laboratory of repressive practices that shocked international public opinion and contributed decisively to the deterioration of the French image in the world. The techniques used by the French paratroopers during the Battle of Algiers would subsequently inspire repressive practices adopted by other military forces in similar conflicts in Latin America and other regions of the Third World, demonstrating how the Algerian War constituted a formative moment in the evolution of counterinsurgency doctrines during the Cold War. The systematic use of torture by French forces in Algeria created a deep moral and political crisis in French society, dividing public opinion between those who considered these methods necessary for maintaining French sovereignty and those who denounced them as unacceptable violations of the humanist values that supposedly distinguished Western civilization. This internal French division had important repercussions on the dynamics of the Cold War, as it weakened Paris's capacity to present itself as a defender of democratic and humanist values in the face of Soviet authoritarianism. The question of torture in Algeria transformed into a powerful argument in Soviet propaganda against the West, allegedly demonstrating the hypocrisy of capitalist democracies that preached human rights but practiced brutal repression in their colonies. Simultaneously, the controversy over French methods in Algeria contributed to radicalizing important sectors of the Western intellectual community, particularly in France, creating a generation of thinkers and activists who would fundamentally question the legitimacy of the capitalist system and the international order dominated by the Western powers. The evolution of the Algerian nationalist movement during this period was characterized by a process of ideological radicalization and organizational sophistication that transformed it into one of the most effective national liberation organizations of the Cold War period. The National Liberation Front gradually developed a complex political military structure, combining the armed action of the National Liberation Army with a clandestine political apparatus capable of mobilizing different sectors of Algerian society and developing sophisticated international relations. The influence of socialist and third worldist ideologies on the thinking of the Algerian leadership became progressively more evident, particularly through the adoption of principles of social and economic organization inspired by socialist experiences, although always adapted to the cultural and religious specificities of Algerian society. This ideological evolution of the FLN contributed to bringing the Algerian nationalist movement closer to Soviet positions on international issues, creating growing concerns in Western capitals about the future orientations of an eventual independent Algeria. The creation of the Provisional Government of the Algerian Republic, GPRA, in 1958, represented a fundamental qualitative leap in the strategy of internationalizing the conflict developed by the National Liberation Front, establishing a formal political entity capable of developing diplomatic relations with other states and representing the Algerian cause in international forums. The GPRA, initially established in Tunis under the presidency of Ferhat Abbas, quickly managed to gain recognition from dozens of countries, particularly in the Arab, African, and socialist world, creating a diplomatic network that conferred international legitimacy on the struggle for independence and significantly complicated the French position in multilateral organizations. The GPRA's diplomacy revealed a sophisticated understanding of the dynamics of the Cold War, skillfully seeking to balance the support of socialist countries with the establishment of relations with Western powers interested in weakening the French position or in preparing for an eventual post-colonial transition that would preserve their economic and strategic interests in the region. The impact of the Algerian War on French internal politics reached dramatic proportions in 1958, culminating in the May Crisis that led to the collapse of the Fourth Republic and the return of Charles de Gaulle to power after 12 years of political ostracism. The revolt of the French settlers and sectors of the army in Algiers, who demanded the maintenance of French Algeria and threatened to march on Paris, revealed the extent to which the colonial conflict had deeply fractured French political institutions and created a situation of near civil war. The inability of successive Fourth Republic governments to find a political solution to the Algerian question had created a leadership vacuum that threatened the very democratic stability of France, with potentially serious implications for the balance of power in Western Europe during the Cold War. De Gaulle's return represented a desperate attempt to restore the authority of the French state and find an honorable way out of a conflict that had become unsustainable from military, political, and diplomatic standpoints. Charles de Gaulle's arrival in power in June 1958 introduced a new dynamic into the evolution of the Algerian conflict, characterized by a more pragmatic and realistic approach that implicitly recognized the long-term unsustainability of the French position in Algeria. General de Gaulle, with his experience in the French resistance during World War II and his deep understanding of the geopolitical realities of the Cold War, clearly perceived that the indefinite continuation of the Algerian conflict would fatally weaken the French position on the international stage and compromise France's most important strategic objectives as a European and global power. The Gaullist strategy was characterized by a skillful combination of military firmness and political openness, simultaneously seeking to demonstrate French determination to maintain order in Algeria and create conditions for an eventual negotiation that would preserve fundamental French interests in a region considered vital for national greatness ambitions and for access to the energy resources of the Sahara. De Gaulle's Algerian policy also developed in the broader context of his strategy to restore French greatness and assert national independence in the face of the Cold War superpowers. The Gaullist project of France as a third global force, capable of leading a Europe independent of the United States and the Soviet Union, necessarily required the resolution of the Algerian question, which absorbed enormous resources and limited French diplomatic maneuverability. The Algerian War prevented France from playing the role of European leader to which de Gaulle aspired, as it kept the country in a defensive and reactive position that contradicted the ambitions of an assertive and independent foreign policy. The Gaullist perception was that the indefinite maintenance of colonial control over Algeria constituted a fundamental obstacle to the emergence of France as an autonomous global power, capable of developing privileged relations with both the Arab and African world and with the superpowers themselves. The evolution of the American position regarding the Algerian conflict during de Gaulle's presidency reflected the growing tensions between Washington and Paris over the orientations of French foreign policy and the future of the Atlantic Alliance. The Eisenhower administration, and subsequently the Kennedy administration, demonstrated a growing concern about the consequences of the Algerian War for the stability of the Western Alliance and for the West's position on the African continent, where accelerating decolonization created important opportunities for the expansion of Soviet influence. The United States understood that the indefinite continuation of the Algerian conflict could radicalize African nationalist movements and push them into the Soviet orbit, thus compromising Western strategic interests in a region that was becoming progressively important in the context of the Cold War. This perception led Washington to exert discreet but increasing pressure on Paris to find a negotiated solution to the conflict, creating significant tensions in the Franco-American bilateral relationship that would subsequently manifest themselves in other issues of European and Atlantic politics. The progressive radicalization of French settlers in Algeria and sectors of the colonial army created a situation of dual loyalty that seriously threatened the authority of the French state and enormously complicated any attempt at negotiation with the Algerian nationalists. The formation of the secret army organization, Organisation de l'Armée Secrète, OAS, in 1961, bringing together dissident military personnel and extremist settlers determined to prevent Algerian independence by all means, transformed the conflict into a de facto civil war within the French camp itself. The terrorist activities of the OAS both in Algeria and metropolitan France, including several assassination attempts against de Gaulle himself, revealed the depth of the divisions created by the Algerian War in French society and the risks that an eventual Algerian independence represented for French internal political stability. This situation of near civil war significantly complicated the strategic calculations of the superpowers, who viewed with concern the possibility of a severe destabilization of one of the main powers of the Atlantic Alliance at a crucial moment in the Cold War. The negotiation of the Evian Accords between the French government and the National Liberation Front, secretly initiated in 1961 and concluded in March 1962, represented a decisive moment in the resolution of the Algerian conflict and its implications for the global balance of the Cold War. The Accords established not only the modalities of Algerian independence, but also a complex set of arrangements that sought to preserve French strategic interests, particularly access to the oil resources of the Sahara and the maintenance of important military bases for the French nuclear strategy. The negotiating skill demonstrated by both French diplomacy and the FLN leadership revealed the political maturity achieved by both parties after 8 years of devastating conflict, as well as the pressure exerted by the international context to find a solution that would avoid the complete radicalization of the conflict, with unforeseen implications for the regional and global balance. The Evian Accords thus constituted a complex compromise that recognized the inevitability of Algerian independence, but sought to frame it within a structure of post-colonial relations that preserved important elements of French influence in the region. The proclamation of Algerian independence in July 1962 marked the end of one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts of the decolonization period, but simultaneously opened a new chapter in the evolution of international relations during the Cold War, with profound implications for the balance of power in the Mediterranean, the African continent, and the Arab world. The new Democratic and Popular Republic of Algeria emerged as an independent state in a particularly complex international conjuncture, characterized by the intensification of competition between the superpowers in peripheral regions and the accelerating process of decolonization that created dozens of new actors in the international system. The Algerian leadership, forged during 8 years of armed struggle and profoundly influenced by Third Worldist and socialist ideologies, immediately positioned the country as one of the main defenders of the non-aligned movement and as a systematic critic of the international system dominated by the Western powers, thus contributing to the complexification of the Cold War dynamics in a strategically vital region. The impact of Algerian independence on the regional dynamics of North Africa and the Middle East was immediately manifested through the strengthening of the Arab nationalist axis led by Nasser's Egypt, but also through the emergence of new tensions and rivalries that would significantly complicate the strategic calculations of the superpowers in the region. Independent Algeria rapidly transformed into one of the main supporters of national liberation movements in Africa, providing training bases, weaponry, and logistical support for organizations like the Mozambique Liberation Front, Frelimo, the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA, and the African National Congress, ANC, thus contributing to the internationalization of conflicts that would become important battlefields of the Cold War. This policy of support for African revolutionary movements was part of the Algerian leadership's broader strategy of positioning the country as one of the main powers of the Third World and as a center for the irradiation of anti-imperialist and Third Worldist ideologies that challenge the established international order. The socialist orientation progressively adopted by independent Algeria materialized in the nationalization of oil resources and the implementation of development policies based on centralized planning constituted a source of significant concern for the Western powers, but also created important opportunities for the expansion of Soviet influence in the Western Mediterranean. The Soviet Union quickly recognized Algeria's strategic potential as a regional ally, developing important economic and military relations that included the sale of sophisticated weaponry, cooperation in the exploitation of natural resources, and technical support for the country's industrialization. This Soviet-Algerian rapprochement particularly worried the United States and France, who saw privileged relations between Algiers and Moscow as a potential threat to regional stability and Western interests in accessing energy resources in North Africa. However, the Algerian leadership consistently demonstrated a remarkable capacity to maintain its political autonomy in the face of superpower pressures, developing a non-aligned diplomacy that sought to maximize the benefits of competition between blocs without definitively committing to either of them. The consequences of the Algerian War for the evolution of France itself constitute one of the most significant aspects of the impact of this conflict on the dynamics of the Cold War, particularly through the institutional and political transformations that led to the consolidation of the Fifth Republic and the emergence of a Gaullist strategy of national independence in the face of the superpowers. The traumatic experience of the Algerian War contributed decisively to the radicalization of French foreign policy under de Gaulle, who systematically sought to affirm French national autonomy vis-à-vis the United States and develop privileged relations with the Soviet Union and with Third World countries. This evolution of French foreign policy created significant tensions within the Atlantic Alliance, manifested in France's withdrawal from NATO's Integrated Command in 1966 and the independent development of the French nuclear force, decisions that were directly influenced by the lessons learned from the Algerian experience about the limits of Western solidarity and the need to preserve national autonomy on issues considered vital. The influence of the Algerian War on the development of military doctrines and counterinsurgency strategies during the Cold War extended far beyond French borders, inspiring both the armed forces of other Western countries and national liberation movements on different continents. The techniques of psychological warfare, civic military action, and population control developed during the Algerian conflict were subsequently adapted and applied by American forces in Vietnam, by Portuguese forces in Africa, and by different Latin American armies in the internal conflicts that marked the Cold War in Latin America. Simultaneously, the guerrilla warfare and popular mobilization strategies used by the National Liberation Front became inspiring models for revolutionary movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, contributing to the diffusion of tactics and methods that would significantly complicate the efforts of Western powers to maintain stability in peripheral regions considered strategically important. The legacy of the November 1, 1954, insurrection and the Algerian War that resulted from it widely transcends the temporal and geographical borders of the conflict, constituting a crucial formative moment in the evolution of the international system during the Cold War, and the emergence of new paradigms in relations between the developed world and the developing world. The capacity demonstrated by the National Liberation Front to defeat one of the main European powers through the skillful combination of armed struggle, popular mobilization, and international diplomacy created an inspiring precedent for nationalist and revolutionary movements worldwide, contributing to accelerating the process of decolonization and complicating the efforts of the superpowers to control political transformations in peripheral regions. The Algerian example demonstrated that well-organized and determined national liberation movements could successfully challenge imperial powers, even when they had overwhelming military superiority and the support of Western allies, thus establishing a strategic model that would subsequently be replicated and adapted in multiple geographical and political contexts during the following decades of the Cold War.